Welcome. How is it that some federal agencies, in particular the Department of Education, attempt to overpower states that resist the particular agenda they want forced on the states? Well, there's several dimensions to this.
The Baker Brief with law professor John Baker. Your weekly dispatch from the battlefield of ideas.
The size of the federal government, and therefore the administrative state, is much larger than anyone can really comprehend. I'm focusing on the Department of Education for two reasons. Well, first of all, as I already discussed, there's really no constitutional basis for such a department to begin with. Moreover, ordinary Americans probably have more interest in the Department of Education, or at least what it's doing, than they do regarding any other agency except maybe the IRS. And the Department of Education can have an even more profound effect on you and your family than the IRS. So, what has been going on recently that in particular has upset many parents around the country? Well, first of all, what's happening is that this administration is using the power of the purse, the spending power, to an attempt to force onto or persuade with money, either way you want to look at it, local and state departments of education to adopt the ideological agenda that they're pushing, which involves two main things: critical race theory and transgenderism. But as to critical race theory, you need to understand, and I've mentioned it before, that this is something that comes out of universities and academic centers, and it's a derivative of what's called critical theory generally. Critical theory coming from Europe is, quote, Marxist and postmodern. Well, what is postmodern? I mentioned this before, but it's worth reminding. The modern era has been characterized by reason. Postmodern is post-reason, really. And it's largely irrational, meaning that reason doesn't have much to do with their understanding of society. It's all about power. Well, you mix that with the Marxism, and we no longer so much focus on class struggle as we have a focus on race struggle. Those two elements are the main things, at least right now until they change, of what the leftist agenda is in terms of foisting it on your children and changing the understanding of people around the country. So how do they do this? Well, because we're dealing with the, quote, administrative state, what we realize is that they are in fact making binding rules, sometimes should be, based on what Congress has actually legislated, although they are allowed to, quote, promulgate regulations. And sometimes it's using other less formal devices. In any event, regarding critical race theory, they proposed in April of 2021 a grant program that prioritized those grant requests for civics and history that focused on, or at least included, critical race theory. Well, that created an uproar and reaction. And that reaction caused a change. They backed off in July of 2021. What happened? A number of states, through the attorneys general, objected strenuously to what was going on, and they knew they might be facing lawsuits. And then some of the senators got involved and they objected, so they backed off. What does this do to the legislative process? This wasn't legislation, this was so-called rulemaking. This is putting things backwards. That is, Congress is supposed to make the law and they're supposed to administer it. What we have instead is they're effectively making law and having Congress and others try to object to it and stop them from doing it. This is not how self-government is supposed to work. It flips the whole process of binding people to rules and law. We have a very different form of government under the administrative state. Formally, we have a legislative process, but in reality, we have many more administrative agencies full of many employees who are busy making all kinds of new regulations, much more than what Congress is doing by way of legislation. And they don't have to run for office. They're not accountable. Well, this is in the executive branch. And you would say, at least we're, the executive branch, the president appointed and the Senate confirmed the Secretary of Education. So isn't that better? Well, wait a minute. The president hasn't got lawmaking power either. Well, he has the ability to execute, yes, but there's a big difference between executing and making in effect new law. That is, rules that are binding on us in a way that changes radically, in some cases, our understanding of what the particular legislation they're operating on was based on. So besides rulemaking, however, there are less formal things like interpretation. So in June of 2021, the department announced that they were going to have a big effort in terms of protecting the rights of transgender students. They based this on a Supreme Court decision from 2020 called Bostock versus Clayton County. And using that, they want to make this a requirement because they interpret sex to include anything related to sex change or sex identity. Now, some states thereafter banned the teaching both of critical race theory and any kind of promotion of transgenderism. And in both, they were sued. The states were sued by whom? By the American Civil Liberties Union. And what was the argument? The argument was state laws banning what teachers can teach in state-paid schools, state-funded schools, teachers paid by the state. This violates their freedom of speech. Well, that's nonsense. Not that people won't argue it, but that's what we get often in litigation, is the attempt to make new arguments that in the past would have been deemed frivolous, but now are given some credence. Well, again, what we have is an executive branch and a judicial branch, in effect, creating binding rules on the country, sometimes based on statutes that have been interpreted by a department like the Department of Education, often a questionable interpretation. The point is, what we're getting is not lawmaking by legislators who are elected by the public. The binding effect of these rules on the general public is being effectively made by people that have not been elected by the voters. That is a critical situation in terms of self-government, in terms of separation of powers. Next week, we will turn to higher education.
To ensure your continued access to the Baker Brief, please note our additional channels listed below. And remember to like and subscribe using the bell icon.